The truck came every Tuesday. That was the first thing people in the neighborhood noticed. Not the boy, not the barn. The truck, a heavy flatbed from Blue Ridge Timber Company, rattling down the gravel road before 7 in the morning, his diesel engine announcing itself a full minute before it turned the corner onto the Mercer property. The driver, Dex Hollowell, had been hauling timber for 31 years. He was 62 years old, silver-haired, with a face so weathered by Carolina sun and mountain wind that his smile lines had become permanent features whether he was smiling or not. He wore the same faded blue cap every single day. He drove the same route every single week. And every Tuesday morning, without ceremony or explanation, he backed that flatbed up to the corner of the Mercer property and let the logs slide. They landed with a sound like the earth clearing its throat. Twisted maple trunks too gnarled for commercial flooring. Walnut blocks split along old fault lines, their dark heartwood exposed like a wound that had never quite closed. Oak sections too wide for standard milling, too irregular for anything a commercial buyer would touch. Pieces of American hardwood that had grown for decades in the Blue Ridge soil and had been deemed by the calculations of industry to be worth nothing at all. The pile grew a little taller every Tuesday. And every Tuesday, without fail, Hatch Grindley found a reason to drive past. Hatch was 71 years old, a retired carpenter who had spent 4 decades building barns and farmhouses across western North Carolina. He was a compact man with deep-set eyes the color of creek water in autumn, thick white eyebrows that moved independently of the rest of his face, and hands so calloused they looked like they had been carved from the same hardwood now sitting in the Mercer yard. He had built good things in his life, solid things. He believed in straight grain and clean cuts and materials that behaved the way materials were supposed to behave. What he saw accumulating behind the Mercer property offended something deep in his professional understanding of what wood was for. He slowed his truck one morning in October, rolled down the window, and watched Dex Hollowell release another load. The logs crashed down onto the pile with that familiar thud. Hatch looked at the heap for a long moment. Then he looked at the old barn, standing just beyond it, weathered red paint peeling away in long strips, roof sagging slightly on the eastern side, doors closed tight against the morning cold. He shook his head slowly. "Boy's building himself a bonfire for the next 100 winters," he said to no one in particular, and drove on. He was not the only one who said something like it. The family 2 properties over made jokes about it at their dinner table. The woman who ran the small feed store on Route 9 mentioned it to 3 different customers in a single afternoon. Even Dex Hollowell, who was by nature a man of few opinions and fewer words, had privately wondered more than once whether the whole arrangement made any reasonable kind of sense. Nobody thought to ask Colt Mercer what he thought about it. This was partly because Colt Mercer was 15 years old, and therefore in the social arithmetic of Asheville's outer neighborhoods, not yet entitled to a serious opinion about anything that required expertise. But it was mostly because by the time Dex's truck had finished unloading and pulled back down the gravel road, Colt was already inside the barn with the doors shut and had been since well before the truck arrived. He had been in there since 5:30. Colt was not a large boy, not yet. He stood 5'7" in his work boots, lean in the way that comes from physical labor rather than athletics, with dark brown hair, almost always covered by a faded cap stained with sawdust and wood oil. His hands were older than the rest of him. They were rough and mapped with the small, precise cuts that accumulate over years of working with sharp tools in close quarters. Not dramatic injuries, but the kind of minor marks that woodworkers collect the way other people collect small memories without intending to, simply through the accumulation of days. His hazel eyes had a quality that people who met him sometimes struggled to describe afterward. They moved slowly over everything the way a person reads something important rather than the way most boys his age looked at the world, consuming without absorbing. Colt's eyes absorbed. They stayed on surfaces longer than was socially expected, finding information in things that most people had already classified and moved past. He had learned to look that way in the 3 years since his mother died. June Mercer had been 41 years old when the cancer found her. She was a quiet woman with long dark hair and a habit of humming to herself while she worked, not recognizable songs exactly, just melodic shapes she invented and discarded as she moved through the rooms of the house and the tasks of the day. She had worked the front desk at a dental office in East Asheville for 11 years, had raised Colt with steady hands and a specific kind of patience that never felt like resignation. She was not a woman who complained. She was not a woman who left meals unfinished or conversations half-started or projects abandoned on the kitchen table, except that in the end, she had left one thing unfinished. Colt did not know this until the autumn morning he found her sketchbook. He had been looking for a small pry bar he kept in the old dresser in the corner of the barn, the dresser that had belonged to his grandfather and that his father, Burrell, had moved out of the house years ago to make space for the adjustable bed frame June needed in her final months. The dresser drawers were stiff and swollen from the humidity that accumulated in the barn through summer. The third drawer required both hands and a firm, steady pull, and when it finally came free, Colt stumbled back half a step and looked down at what the drawer had been concealing. Not the pry bar, a sketchbook. Navy blue cover, soft, from handling not recent handling, but the accumulated softness of something carried for a long time and returned too often. The spiral binding was slightly bent, as though the book had lived in a bag for months or years. Colt picked it up the way you pick up something that might be fragile, with both hands, slowly, without fully understanding why caution seemed necessary. He sat down on an overturned crate and opened it. The first page held a dragon. Small, precise, rendered in pencil with the careful attention of someone who had studied the subject seriously before committing anything to paper. The body coiled in on itself with anatomical logic, the musculature of the legs and neck drawn with layered detail the scales indicated with patient cross-hatching that must have taken several hours to complete. Beside the drawing in his mother's handwriting, that slightly forward-leaning script he would have recognized anywhere, a single notation red oak, tight grain no larger than my hand. He turned the page. An eagle wings fully spread, each primary feather individually sketched. Notes along the margin: walnut for the dark sections, maple for the breast. Study how the grain moves before the first cut. Another page. A wolf, mid-stride, its weight distributed across 3 legs with the quiet accuracy of someone who had watched real animals move and had not trusted memory alone to record what they had seen, page after page. Creature after creature. Each one annotated with material's grain direction, specific wood species. These were not the casual doodles of someone passing idle time. They were plans. His mother had studied this. She had thought about it the way an engineer thinks about a structure, practically precisely with specific material requirements noted against each design element. And she had never made a single one of them. Colt sat in the barn for a very long time with the sketchbook open across his knees. The morning light came through the gaps in the boards and fell across the pages in long, pale stripes. Outside, he could hear the last sounds of Dex's truck fading down the gravel road, and then nothing but the wind moving through the pine trees that lined the back property boundary. At the very back of the sketchbook, on the final page, someone had written a single line in pencil. The handwriting was his mother's, but different from the margin notes, smaller, more deliberate, each letter formed with the care of someone who wanted to be sure of what they were leaving behind. For the boy who will finish what I was afraid to start. Colt read it twice. He read it a third time. Then he closed the sketchbook and set it on the workbench in the center, where he could see it from anywhere in the barn, regardless of where he was standing. He did not tell his father. Burrell Mercer was 46 years old and built like someone who had spent 2 decades doing hard physical work, and then spent several years having his body remind him of it in specific and unignorable ways. He was broad across the shoulders, with short salt and pepper hair and a beard he kept trimmed more out of habit than vanity. His hands were mapped with old scars from maintenance work, years of repairing industrial equipment at a regional manufacturing facility, of working in tight spaces with machinery that did not accommodate mistakes gracefully. He walked with a stiffness in his lower back that was worse in cold weather, and that he never mentioned directly, though Colt had learned to read it in the specific economy of how his father moved through the kitchen on winter mornings. Burrell was not a man who talked much about feelings. He was instead a man who left woodworking magazines on the kitchen table every week and made breakfast every morning before his 6 a.m. shift, and who had once driven 40 minutes to a thrift store in Hendersonville because someone mentioned they had an old hand tool catalog that might interest a boy who worked with wood. He had brought it home and left it by the coffee maker without saying a word about where he had found it or what the drive had cost him in time and a stiff back. That was how he loved. In the margins, in the small practical gestures that required effort but made no noise about requiring it. Colt understood this language. He had learned to read it the same way he had learned to read wood grain, slowly, patiently, by paying close attention to what was actually present rather than what he expected or wished to find. The morning after he found the sketchbook, Colt came downstairs to the usual things. 2 plates on the table, eggs on the stove, a fresh woodworking trade journal sitting next to his glass of orange juice. Burroughs stood at the counter with his coffee looking out the kitchen window at the backyard, where the morning light was just reaching the edge of the barn. "Dex left some good-sized maple this week," Burroughs said without turning around. "I saw it," Colt said. That was the whole conversation. Burrell finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, put on his jacket, and left for work. Colt ate his eggs, picked up the trade journal, and went out to the barn. He had work to do. The first serious project he attempted from his mother's sketchbook was not one of the creatures she had drawn. It came to him instead while he was lying awake the previous night, staring at the ceiling in the particular dark of a Carolina October when the nights turn cold fast and the silence outside is a different quality of silence than summer silence. He had been thinking about a walnut block Dex had dropped 6 weeks earlier. The piece was nearly black in its darkest sections, with grain that moved in long, twisting curves that suggested something alive flexing beneath the surface. He had been studying that block for weeks without touching it, watching it, learning what it had to say before deciding what to do about it. He decided it wanted to become venom. He had been drawn to the character since he was 9 years old, the anti-hero, with the impossible grin and the monstrous tongue, equally terrifying and oddly compelling. He had seen the character rendered in plastic and ink and digital animation. He had never seen it in wood. He was not sure anyone had ever tried. He started with the head. The blocking out phase took 4 sessions across 2 weeks, each one lasting an hour or more after homework was finished and the dinner dishes were done. The barn's single overhead work light cast strong shadows that made the emerging form look more dramatic than it probably was, which Colt appreciated. It helped him see where the piece was going before it fully arrived. He worked with a set of chisels bought secondhand from a closing hardware store in East Asheville, supplemented by a carving knife his grandfather had owned that had been resharpened so many times the blade was now half its original width but held an edge that the new tools could not match. The face came together slowly, the forehead broad and angular, the cheekbones pronounced aggressive, the eyes wide, slightly asymmetrical, suggesting something simultaneously feral and intelligent. Colt spent 3 full sessions on the eyes alone, shaving thin layers of walnut at a time, checking the depth from multiple angles in the work light, adjusting what he found. He was halfway through the mouth when the tongue broke. It happened with the clean finality of things that break along grain lines, a single sharp sound, and then the piece was in 2 parts, the longer section lying on the workbench like a quiet accusation. Colt set down his chisel. He picked up the broken piece and held it against the face and looked at what the gap had become. He sat with it for a long time. What he found eventually was not a mistake. The break had occurred at a slight diagonal, not straight across, but angled, creating a jagged edge along the lower section of the tongue that remained attached. The jagged edge, he noticed after several minutes of looking, appeared intentional. It appeared violent. It appeared, if he was being fully honest with himself, more genuinely like the character than the smooth, clean tongue he had been carefully carving. He set the broken piece aside permanently. He spent the next 3 sessions redesigning the entire mouth around what the accident had left him. He opened the drawer wider. He deepened the corners, creating heavy shadows that the work light caught and held. He brought the remaining tongue down at a sharper angle, following the diagonal of the break rather than correcting it, and shaped the tip to curl slightly as though the creature were caught mid-motion rather than posed. When he stepped back from the finished head, he was quiet for a long time. It was better, not marginally. The accident had forced him to solve a problem he had not known he was carrying. The original design had been competent, but controlled the tongue, too neat, too deliberate, too clearly the product of a plan. The redesign had an energy the original had lacked entirely. The walnut's dark grain moved through the muscles of the jaw in a way that looked almost liquid. Colt put his tools down, turned off the work light, and stood in the doorway of the barn. Outside, the October air was cold and clear. The pile of discarded hardwood sat at the edge of the property in the moonlight, casting irregular shadows across the frost-stiffened grass. He understood something now that he had not understood that morning. The wood was not a problem to be overcome. It was a partner to be listened to. The grain had its own logic, its own preferences, its own understanding of how it wanted to move. His job was not to force the material into a shape he had already decided on. His job was to find the shape the material was already suggesting and then develop the skill and patience to reveal it. He went back inside, opened his mother's sketchbook to the drawing of the dragon, and looked at it for a long time before going to bed. Not the dragon, not yet. He had other things to learn first. Over the weeks that followed, he worked through a sequence of projects that each taught him something specific and irreplaceable. A slender ash log that curved naturally at one end became Spider-Man, caught mid-swing the natural arc of the wood, providing the sense of arrested motion that no amount of technical carving could have manufactured from a straight piece. Colt did not fight the curve. He built the figure around it, and the result had a kinetic quality that made people look at it twice and then look again, trying to understand how something made from a single fixed material could appear to be moving. An unusually smooth section of walnut with an even straight grain became the faceplate of Iron Man's helmet. The smoothness of that piece was not a limitation to be worked around, it was the point. Where the grain was visible, Colt carved subtle shadow lines into the surface at precise angles that caught the work light and suggested brushed metal. Where the grain was tight and nearly invisible, the surface reflected the overhead light in a way that looked from the right angle almost polished. He spent 11 hours on the eye slots alone, cutting each one at a calculated angle so that the shadow inside would fall correctly from multiple viewing positions. A massive maple block nearly 80 pounds irregular in shape, the grain sweeping in broad arcs that refused to be ignored, resisted every subtle approach he tried. Colt spent an entire Saturday morning standing in front of it, with his arms crossed, circling it, crouching to see it from below, standing on a step stool to see it from above. By noon, he understood. The block did not want subtlety. The sweeping grain was the point. It wanted to be Hulk, not the character at rest, but at the apex of some impossible exertion, every system of the body fully engaged. The irregular shape that would have been a problem for any conventional design became the natural asymmetry of a body caught in violent motion. The grain became the musculature. Colt worked on the Hulk for 3 weeks. When he finished, he set it on the shelf he had built along the east wall of the barn beside the Venom head and the Spider-Man figure and the Iron Man helmet. And he stood in the barn doorway and looked at all 4 of them together in the afternoon light that came through the gaps in the boards at that hour. His father came in that Saturday with 2 mugs of hot chocolate, something he had not done since Colt was much younger, before June died, before the house became quieter than either of them had known how to fill. Burrell stood beside his son and looked at the shelf without speaking. Then he looked at the half-organized stacks of remaining logs in the center of the barn, sorted now by species, the maple separate from the walnut, separate from the oak. The pieces Colt had already identified as having possibilities separated from the ones that hadn't yet told him anything. "What are you waiting for on that one?" Burrell asked, nodding toward a large walnut block in the corner that Colt had not yet touched. Colt considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm waiting for it to tell me what it wants to be," he said. Burrell looked at his son. He took a slow drink of his hot chocolate and turned back to the shelf. "Okay," he said. Just the one word. But something in the way it arrived, not dismissive, not humoring, but genuinely settling into acceptance, told Colt that his father understood more than the word itself contained. That the man who expressed care through magazines and early breakfasts and long drives to second-hand shops had been paying close attention all along in his own language to what was happening in the old barn every afternoon after school. The Godzilla project began on a Tuesday evening in late November, after the latest delivery from Dex had included a piece of maple unlike anything Colt had seen in months of working with discarded hardwood. He had heard the term flame maple, figured maple in the trade journals his father brought home, and he had understood the concept. Seeing it in a piece of actual wood was a different experience entirely. Where Dex had made a single exploratory cut across one end of the log before loading it, the cross-section revealed a grain pattern that moved in deep, undulating waves, dark and pale, alternating in curves that appeared to shift as the light changed. It looked to Colt's eye less like a feature of the wood and more like the wood was breathing. He knew immediately what it needed to become. He made a single sketch that evening, working quickly, his pencil moving across the paper with the confidence that comes not from certainty about the outcome, but from clarity about the beginning. The body massive and low-slung weight distributed with geological patience. The dorsal spines irregular and organic, following the natural contours of the log, rather than conforming to any symmetrical pattern. The face not simply monstrous, but heavy with the particular patience of something ancient, something that operated on a time scale that made human concerns feel very small. He set the sketch on the workbench beside his mother's sketchbook and looked at both of them together under the work light. The dragon she had drawn in the first pages of her notebook bore a structural kinship to what he was now designing. Different creature, different scale, different intent. But the same fundamental question underneath both drawings: how do you find the shape of something that has never existed inside a piece of wood that has been growing in the earth for 60 or 70 years? He thought she would have understood that question immediately. He thought she probably had understood it alone in whatever quiet hours she had found to fill those notebook pages with plans she had never acted on. Outside in the blue dark of the November evening, the flame maple block sat at the center of the pile, its extraordinary grain hidden beneath bark and time. No one passing on the road would have looked at it and seen anything but industrial waste. Matter out of place. A problem designated for disposal. Colt Mercer looked at it and saw the beginning of something that had not yet existed anywhere in the world. He picked up his sketchbook, added 3 margin notes to the Godzilla design, and went inside for dinner. He had work to do in the morning. Burrell was at the stove when Colt came in, making the kind of meal he had learned to cook well in the years since June died: pan-fried chicken potatoes, something green that had made it through to November in the small kitchen garden out back. He set the plate down with the care of someone who had decided that small daily acts deserved to be done with attention. They ate mostly in silence, which had been their way for 3 years now. Not an uncomfortable silence. The silence of people who have lived through something difficult together and have found that words in the aftermath of certain kinds of loss sometimes feel insufficient to what they are being asked to carry. Halfway through dinner, Burrell nodded toward the barn. "The maple deck's left today," he said. "The figured one." "Already started sketching," Colt said. Something moved across his father's face, not quite pride, or not only pride, but something more specific and more complicated. The expression of a man who sees his child doing something he himself could not do and feels 2 things at once: genuine joy and a quiet grief at his own distance from it. "Don't rush it," Burrell said. "I won't," Colt said. They finished dinner. Burrell washed the dishes while Colt dried them, the same division they had maintained since Colt was tall enough to reach the counter without standing on anything. The kitchen was warm and smelled like food and faintly like the sawdust that had worked its way permanently into Colt's clothes and could not be fully washed out. Before he went to bed, Colt stopped at the barn door one more time. He did not go in, just stood in the doorway and looked at the shelf along the east wall. Venom with his redesigned jaw, Spider-Man suspended mid-swing, Iron Man's helmet catching the light along its carefully beveled edges, Hulk frozen at the apex of something enormous. And on the workbench open to the first page, his mother's sketchbook. The dragon looked back at him from the page. Patient. Precise. waiting with the stillness of something that had been waiting long enough that it had stopped keeping track of the time. He turned off the light and went inside. Tomorrow the work would continue. The figured maple would be waiting, the sketches would be refined, the tools would be sharpened and laid out in order before the first cut. And somewhere in the darkness of the barn, in a pile of discarded timber that the neighbors had written off and the timber company had designated for disposal and the world had collectively decided was worth nothing at all, a creature was already taking shape. It did not know yet what it would become, but it was there waiting in the wood, the way things wait when they have nowhere else to go and have learned not to measure the waiting. Patient, quiet, ready. The video went up on a Thursday. By Saturday morning, Burrell Mercer's phone had rung 11 times before 8 o'clock. By Sunday evening, he had stopped counting the calls and started writing down the names. It had begun the way significant things sometimes begin quietly, without announcement building before anyone recognized what was building. Sable Pruitt had posted the film on a Friday night with a plain title, The Boy Turning Scrap Wood into Legends, and 43 minutes of footage she had spent 3 weeks editing from nearly 6 hours of material. The editing was spare and unhurried. Long, unbroken shots of Colt's hands moving across walnut. The sound of a chisel meeting wood clean, precise the sound of intention. The work light casting hard shadows across a face emerging from material that had been designated for disposal. Sable had not tried to make it dramatic. She had not needed to. By Saturday breakfast across Asheville, the video had been shared 40,000 times. By Sunday, it had crossed 250,000. By Monday evening, when Colt came home from school and found his father in the kitchen holding the phone with an expression that had not settled into any single thing, it had passed 600,000, and the number was still moving upward. Colt looked at the screen. He looked at his father. "People want to buy things," Burrell said. Colt set his school bag down on the kitchen chair. "How many?" "A lot," Burrell said. That was the beginning of the second phase of things, and it arrived carrying a weight Colt had not anticipated. Not the weight of failure, which he had come to know well enough to carry with some competence. The weight of expectation, which was different in ways he was still learning to identify. The notebook came out that same evening. Burrell sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, and wrote down every inquiry he could find, specific requests, named pieces, people who had described in complete paragraphs what they were looking for and what they were prepared to pay. Collectors, comic enthusiasts, a resort development company based in Asheville whose formal email was signed by someone with the title of Interior Experience Director and who requested a meeting to discuss a large-scale commission. When Burrell reached the bottom of the third page, he set the pen down. "The resort wants something big," he said. "Life-sized, they called it. A Godzilla." Colt thought about the flame maple block in the barn. He had been working on preliminary sketches for 3 weeks, making small decisions about how the grain of that specific piece would interact with the form he was planning. He thought about the resort deadline. 8 weeks. "I'll need more wood," he said. Burrell nodded and wrote something at the top of the next page. Neither of them knew sitting at that table that the wood was already becoming a problem. But before that problem arrived, something else came first. Not all of the reaction to the video was admiration. This was something Colt and Burrell discovered 2 days after the initial surge, when a large account with several 100,000 followers posted a screenshot from the video alongside a question, "Is this AI generated?" No 15-year-old makes something like this. The comment section beneath it split immediately, people who had watched the full film arguing against people who had not, the argument generating its own momentum independent of any evidence on either side. Burrell showed Colt the screen in the kitchen that evening. Colt read through a dozen comments. Then he set the phone on the table and looked at it for a moment. "Do you want to respond?" Burrell said. Colt pushed the phone back across the table. "The wood already did," he said. 2 days later, Sable posted a second clip. 30 seconds, no music, no narration, just Colt's hands moving across a walnut surface in real time, the chisel finding a line, correcting it, finding it again. Unedited, unenhanced. The kind of footage that cannot be manufactured because it contains the small imperfections and corrections of someone actually learning in real time. The question dissolved. The original video kept moving. The call came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the first video went up. Colt was in the barn when he heard it. Not the words, but the register of his father's voice through the kitchen window, which was cracked against the unseasonable warmth of early December. He could not make out the content. He could make out the tone. Burrell Mercer was not a man whose voice climbed under pressure. He was a man who got quieter when things went wrong, who absorbed difficulty the way old growth absorbs weather, without visible deformation until the accumulation became significant. His voice, coming through that window, was very quiet. Colt set down his tools and waited. Burrell came out to the barn 20 minutes later. He stood in the doorway for a moment before crossing the threshold, and Colt recognized the posture, the slight set of the shoulders, the stillness that preceded the delivery of information Burrell wished he did not have to deliver. "That was Dex," Burrell said. He moved to the workbench and set his hands flat on its surface, bracing himself against something. Blue Ridge got bought out. Charlotte Company Regional Timber Conglomerate. They finalized the acquisition last month. New management has been working through the operational structure. Colt looked at the flame maple block on the barn floor. He had made his first real cuts into it 4 days earlier, the initial blocking the rough removal of material that would establish the fundamental proportions. The work so far looked like nothing recognizable, the way early-stage work always looks like nothing. But he knew what was inside it. He had been learning what was inside it for 3 weeks. "And," he said, "new management sent a formal notice this morning." Burrell did not look away from the workbench surface. "They're ending the arrangement. 30 days. After that, all the waste product goes to an industrial biomass facility under a commercial contract. They're burning it." The barn was quiet. Outside, the December wind moved through the pines with that low, persistent sound like something breathing at a great distance. The work light fell across the shelves, across the lined-up figures, Venom, Spider-Man, Iron Man, Hulk, across the half-organized stacks of remaining logs that had been accumulating since early spring. Colt looked at the Godzilla block. 8 weeks until the resort deadline. 30 days until the supply stopped. "Who's running the new operation?" he said. "Voss Caldwell," Burrell said. "Regional director. He's managing 3 facilities in the western part of the state." Colt nodded. He reached for his chisel. He looked at the block for a moment, then set the chisel back down. "I need to keep working," he said. "I don't want to lose the feel of it." Burrell straightened from the workbench. "I'll make some calls," he said, and went back to the house. Dex Hollowell had made his call from a parking lot. His voice carrying the quality of a man speaking carefully in a public place because what he was saying felt private. 28 years with Blue Ridge. He had adapted to every previous management change, new routes, new protocols, new classifications of what counted as waste and what counted as product. He was not a man who resisted the way things changed. He was also not a man who stopped noticing things. He had noticed over months of Tuesday deliveries the way Colt came out to meet the logs. Not immediately, the boy was always already working, but eventually, once the truck had backed away a safe distance. The boy would walk out and stand at the edge of the pile, and he would look at each piece with a sustained attention that Dex had learned across 3 decades of delivering materials to people who worked with wood to recognize as something more than enthusiasm. It was the same quality he had seen very occasionally in the best craftsmen he had known, the ones who saw the material rather than looking past it at what they intended to do with it. He had started setting pieces aside 3 months into the arrangement. Not all of them. Nothing that would create a discrepancy in the commercial inventory. Just the pieces that fell into what he thought of privately as exceptional waste wood that was not commercially viable and never would be, but that had qualities he had spent 30 years learning to recognize. He had rented a storage unit on the south side of Asheville, a small climate-controlled space, and had paid for it with his own money month by month for 8 months. He had told no one. He had told himself he was not entirely sure why he was doing it, which was not quite accurate. He knew why. He had simply not yet arrived at the moment when saying it out loud made sense. That moment arrived 3 days after the call about the new management. On a Saturday morning, he drove to the Mercer property in his own truck, not the company flatbed, just his aging F250, and knocked on the kitchen door. Burrell answered. He looked at Dex for a moment, then stepped back and opened the door wider. They sat at the kitchen table. Colt came in from the barn when he heard voices, still carrying his work apron sawdust in his hair. He stopped when he saw Dex sitting across from his father. Dex looked at the boy. "I've got something to show you," he said. They drove through the south side of Asheville in Dex's truck, Burrell in front, Colt in the back seat, to a low commercial strip where a row of storage units sat behind chain-link fencing. Dex had a single key on a plain ring. He unlocked the unit and pulled up the rolling door. The smell arrived first. Green wood and dry air, the combination that woodworkers learn to associate with possibility before they have words for what they're sensing. Then the overhead light inside the unit reached the interior, and Colt stepped past the threshold and stopped. The space was stacked to 6 feet on both sides with wood. Not randomly, Dex had organized it with the same methodical care he brought to everything he did. Species grouped together. Larger sections at the back, smaller pieces accessible near the front. And at the very back, centered in the space occupying it with a gravitational authority that made everything else around it feel like context, a block of flame maple so large that Colt could not have encircled it with both arms. 3 feet across at its widest point. The figured grain visible even under the flat storage light, moving in those deep undulating waves that shifted as you changed your angle. Colt stood in front of it without speaking. 8 months, Dex said from behind him. His voice was quiet and slightly rough, the way voices sound when words have been sitting too long, waiting to be said. Paid for this place myself, every month. Wasn't sure what I was keeping it for. He paused. Reckon I do now. Colt turned and looked at the old man. Dex held up the key ring, a single key on a plain ring. The gesture was functional and unceremonious, the same quality as a woodworking magazine left on a kitchen table, the same language as early breakfasts and long drives to second-hand stores. The language of people who express important things through the practical and the concrete because they do not trust words alone to carry the weight. Colt took the key. "Thank you," he said. Dex nodded once. A thing done that needed to be done. Nothing more to be made of it than that. They loaded what they could manage that day and returned twice more that weekend. By Sunday evening, the barn held more quality hardwood than Colt had worked with across all his previous projects combined. The flame maple block occupied the center of the space, and everything else organized itself around it. Burrell stood in the barn doorway that evening. He looked at the inventory. Then he looked at the legal pad with the resort deadline written at the top. 8 weeks, he said. "I know," Colt said. "You've never worked at that scale before." "No." A silence. Then, "You going to be able to do it?" Colt looked at the flame maple block. He thought about the broken tongue on the venom piece and what it had taught him about mistakes. He thought about the ash log that had curved exactly as Spider-Man needed to curve. He thought about his mother's sketchbook and the careful annotations about grain direction and wood species, the plans of someone who had understood the work without having yet done it. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I know what I'm looking for." Burrell held the answer for a moment. "Okay," he said, and went inside. The work began in full the following Monday. Colt rose at 4:30, earlier than he had been rising, the alarm going off in the cold dark, and the barn lit and the tools laid out before the neighborhood had stirred. 2 hours before school on the mornings when it was possible. Every afternoon from the moment he got home until Burrell called him in for dinner. Weekends in their entirety from the first light until the light was gone. The Godzilla project did not proceed without difficulty. Nothing at that scale ever does. The first challenge was structural. A piece of wood nearly 5 feet tall at its highest point would need to bear its own weight without developing the internal stress fractures that could compromise the work over months. Colt had read about this problem in the trade journals and had understood it in the abstract. Solving it in a specific piece of highly figured maple required a different kind of understanding entirely. He filled half a notebook with calculations and failed configurations before arriving at an approach that satisfied him, a solution derived from the natural orientation of the grain that he would not have found without 3 weeks of studying the block before making a single cut. The second challenge was the scales. The design called for thousands of individually carved scale impressions across the body's surface. Not uniform scales. Uniformity would have looked mechanical, wrong, like a pattern applied from outside rather than a texture grown from inside. These needed to vary in size and depth across the body, larger and flatter across the broad planes of the back and shoulders, smaller and more raised along the flanks and neck, creating the impression of something that had actually developed rather than been decorated. Colt developed a system of graduated gouges, each used at a specific angle, and practiced the technique on scrap pieces of maple until the motion existed in his hands without requiring his eyes to supervise it. Then he began. The scale work alone occupied 11 days, woven into the larger sequence of the project. He worked from the dorsal surface down, maintaining a consistent rhythm across thousands of individual cuts that each required a small independent decision about size and angle and depth. The accumulation of those small decisions across thousands of instances would determine whether the finished surface looked alive or manufactured. He knew this. He held it in mind through every session. He thought about his mother during those sessions. Not with the sharp-edged grief of the first year after she died, which had felt like a physical location, a specific pain in a specific place that he could find by pressing on it. More with a sense of her being present in the barn with him, which he did not try to explain or justify. It was simply there, and it seemed worth accepting rather than examining. He thought about the sketchbook, the precise margin notes, the shapes she had studied and planned and never made. He thought about what she had written at the bottom of the last page and about what it meant to prepare something with that kind of care and then be afraid to begin. He kept working. The dorsal spines were the final major element before the detail refinement phase, and they were the part of the project Colt had been thinking about longest. He had decided early that the spines would not be symmetrical. They would follow an organic logic derived from the specific contours of this particular maple block. Each spine planned individually in relation to the ones adjacent to it, its grain orientation checked before a single cut was made. He spent 2 full days planning the spines on paper before touching the wood. Then he cut them. The flame maple's figure ran through the dorsal spines in a way Colt had hoped for, but had not been certain of. The shifting dark and pale of the pattern caught the work light differently at every angle so that the spines appeared to move when you moved around the piece, a quality of visual animation that could not have been designed into the wood. It could only be discovered the way you discover things that were there before you arrived. He finished the spines on a Thursday evening in late January, 3 weeks before the resort deadline. He stepped back from the piece and looked at it. Not finished. Refinement work remained surface texture in certain areas. Transition zones between scale regions, 3 sections of the tail he intended to rework. But the fundamental form was present, and he could see it now with clarity what it was going to be when the remaining work was done. He sat on the overturned crate he used as a stool. The flame maple's grain moved through the creature's body in the way he had hoped and in ways he had not planned. The dark and pale alternated in deep organic waves across the finished sections. The dorsal spines rose in their irregular sequence. The scale impressions resolved at this distance into texture rather than carved detail, something that looked grown rather than made. He reached out and put his hand flat against the surface of the piece. The wood was cool under his palm, smooth where the work was finished, rough where it remained. He could read the difference clearly through touch, the transitions between what was done and what still needed doing. He thought there is still work ahead. He thought it is going to be enough. He stood up from the crate. He picked up his tools. There was still light enough to work, and there was still work that needed doing, and he had learned enough about both of those things to understand that they were not a burden but a gift. The particular gift of having something worth doing, and the ability to do it, which was not a small thing and was not something he intended to take for granted. Colt Mercer picked up his gouge and turned back to the piece. The barn settled around him with its sounds, wind in the eaves, The creak of old boards, the small precise sounds of a chisel finding its line. The work light burned. Outside, the January cold came down off the mountains the way it always did, patient and thorough, finding every gap in every wall. He made the first cut of the evening. The wood received it. The Godzilla was finished on a Tuesday. It was not lost on Colt that it happened on a Tuesday, the same day the trucks used to come, the same day the logs used to land with that thud that the neighborhood had spent months treating as evidence of something foolish. He had worked through the previous night on the final refinements, not because the resort deadline was pressing, the pickup was 4 days away, but because the piece had reached the stage where leaving it felt like leaving a sentence unfinished, where the remaining work pulled him forward with its own gravity. He set his tools down at 20 minutes past 4 in the morning. He stepped back. He looked at what the maple had become. The work light caught the flame pattern at that angle, the dark and pale alternating in deep organic waves, the surface of the creature shifting as Colt moved his weight from foot to foot. The dorsal spines rose in their irregular sequence, each one holding the light differently, the grain running through them at the angles he had planned, and at angles he had not anticipated, the wood making its own contributions in the places where he had allowed it. The scales resolved at this distance from detail into texture, from evidence of carving into evidence of something that had lived. He stood with his arms at his sides and looked at it for a very long time. Then he turned off the work light and went inside and slept. When he came downstairs at noon, Burrell was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee, which meant he had stayed home from work. Burrell Mercer did not stay home from work. Colt looked at the second cup and sat down. They drank in the silence that had developed between them over 3 years of learning to live with loss. Not empty silence, but full of the things that didn't require saying, because they had already been understood through the accumulation of 3 years of mornings and dinners and the specific language of magazines left on tables and dishes dried without being asked. "It's done," Colt said. "I know." Burrell wrapped both hands around his cup. "I looked in this morning, before you were up." Colt waited. "I think your mother would have wanted to see it," Burrell said. Colt looked at the table. He nodded once. It was all he could do with that sentence, receive it and hold it, and not try to do more with it than it was. They finished their coffee. Burrell washed both cups. Colt went back to the barn. The first person outside the family to see the completed piece came 2 days later, and it was not someone Colt had expected. Hatch Grindley pulled his truck up the gravel road on a Thursday afternoon. Hatch had no standing business with the Mercers. His previous interactions with the property had consisted almost entirely of slowing his truck to observe the accumulating woodpile and offering his assessment to no one in particular before driving on. He was 71 years old, and the 4 decades he had spent building things had left him with a craftsman's hard-won certainty about materials, the professional confidence that he understood what good wood looked like and what waste looked like, and that the boundary between them was clear. He knocked on the kitchen door. Burrell answered. "Heard the piece is finished," Hatch said. He did not explain how he had heard it. In neighborhoods of this kind, information moved through its own channels. "Wondered if I might take a look." Burrell looked at him for a moment, then he opened the door wider and led him to the barn. Colt was inside doing the organizational work that follows large projects, cleaning tools, sorting, remaining stock, making notes about what would come next. He looked up when the barn door opened, and his father stepped in with Hatch Grindley behind him. He straightened and waited. Hatch stopped inside the door and looked at the shelves. First, the earlier pieces lined up along the east wall. He moved toward them with the deliberate pace of an experienced man looking at craftsmanship who does not want to arrive at a conclusion before earning one. He stopped in front of the Iron Man helmet and leaned slightly to examine the eye slots, the beveled edges, the way the grain had been used to suggest texture. He straightened. He moved to Spider-Man, to Venom. He stood in front of each one long enough that the looking felt like something more than courtesy. Then he turned and saw the Godzilla. He was still for a long time. Colt watched the old man's face and saw something move across it that he recognized, not from Hatch Grindley's face specifically, which had never shown him anything except skepticism, from other faces at other moments. the expression of someone arriving at a conclusion they had not expected and are deciding how to carry it. Hatch walked toward the piece. He stopped a foot in front of it. He looked at the flame pattern moving through the creature's body, at the dorsal spines, at the thousands of individual scale impressions across the surface. He raised one hand and held it near the wood without touching, the gesture of someone who understands that the impulse to touch fine materials is real and worth respecting without necessarily acting on it. He lowered his hand. He turned to Colt. He removed his cap. "I owe you an apology, son," he said. His voice was level in the way of someone who has decided to say something difficult and has chosen to say it without ornamentation. "I drove past this property for the better part of a year. Looked at those logs every single time. 40 years I worked wood." He paused. "I never saw a damn thing in them." Colt said nothing. There was nothing to add that would improve what Hatch had just said. "Those logs were the same logs," Hatch continued. "Same wood, same grain, same everything." He looked at the Godzilla one last time. "You've taught me something I should have already known. The material doesn't change. The seeing does." He put his cap back on. He nodded at Burrell. He walked out of the barn and drove away. Colt stood in the quiet of the barn after the sound of the truck had faded. Then he picked up his tools and went back to work. Word moved the way it always moved in places like this, through multiple channels, simultaneously, the way water finds its way through terrain. By the end of that week, 3 employees from Blue Ridge Timber's Asheville facility had called Burrell's number independently of each other, each saying a version of the same thing. There was a section of particularly figured walnut, a piece of curly maple wood, scheduled for the biomass stream. Did Colt want it before it went? Burrell wrote the names down and called each one back. He arranged small deliveries that did not conflict with existing contracts and did not require authorization from regional management. Voss Caldwell did not know about these calls. He found out 2 weeks later through the lateral awareness that management develops when something is happening in an organization without having been sanctioned by it. He drove to the Mercer property on a Wednesday morning in a sedan that was too clean for the gravel road, wearing clothes that announced themselves as business clothes, even in the context of a barn, and knocked on the kitchen door. Burrell let him in. Colt was at school. Caldwell sat at the kitchen table, accepted the coffee that was offered, and said what he had come to say with the efficiency of someone who had delivered versions of the same proposition many times before. He was not there about the informal wood transfers. He was there with what he described as a significant opportunity. The videos, both Sable Pruitt's original film and the follow-up she had posted as the Godzilla neared completion, had attracted commercial attention he had not anticipated. There were 3 separate inquiries from potential partners interested in the Mercer Wood Art brand. He was proposing a formal partnership, capital investment, premium material supply, professional production support. The informal arrangements with individual employees would be regularized and scaled. Output would multiply. The market was there. He set a folder on the kitchen table. Burrell looked at the folder. He looked at Caldwell. "You should come back when Colt's home," he said. Caldwell returned that afternoon. Colt sat across the kitchen table from him and listened to the full proposal without interrupting. He was 15 years old, and he sat with a stillness that had nothing to do with experience in business meetings. It had to do with the habit of listening to materials before deciding what to do with them. When Caldwell finished, Colt was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up. "Come look at something," he said. He led Caldwell to the barn. He opened the doors and let the afternoon light fall across the interior. The organized stacks of hardwood, the shelves along the east wall, the tools laid out on the workbench, and at the center of everything the Godzilla, which had not yet been transported, and which occupied the space with a gravity that made everything else feel like context. Caldwell looked at the piece. His expression was carefully managed, not without response, but with the response distributed in quantities that did not commit to anything. Colt let him look. Then, "Which one of those could you make with perfect wood and a hired hand, Mr. Caldwell?" Caldwell looked at him. "That's not really the point of the—" "Which one?" Colt said. Quiet, unhurried. The barn held its silence. The work light hummed. Outside, the February wind moved through the pines. Caldwell looked at the Godzilla. He looked at the shelf, the sequence of pieces in the work light, each one made from wood that had been designated for burning. He looked at the stacks of imperfect, irregular, commercially undesirable hardwood along the barn wall, full of the knots and irregular grain and specific qualities that made it unsuitable for every application the industry had developed for it. He picked up the folder he had brought from the kitchen. He looked at it. He set it on the workbench. "I'll leave this in case you change your mind," he said. He walked out of the barn. Colt heard the sedan on the gravel, and then he did not hear it anymore. He stood alone in the barn and looked at the Godzilla. He thought about his mother's sketchbook, about what she had written at the bottom of the last page, about what it meant to prepare something with precision and care and then be afraid to begin. He thought about the broken tongue on the venom piece, about Dex Hollowell's 8 months of quiet, unexplained preservation, about what all of it had been moving towards separately and together, without any of them fully understanding the direction until they were already most of the way there. He took Caldwell's folder and put it in the drawer under the workbench. Then he picked up his tools and began planning the next piece. The resort truck came on a Saturday, a professional flatbed with rigging equipment and 2 men who knew how to move large, delicate objects without incident. Colt had built a simple cradle to support the Godzilla during transport. The rigging crew examined it and approved it without comment, which was its own form of recognition. They loaded the piece with careful efficiency while Colt watched from the barn door. When the piece was secured and the truck was ready to move, the lead rigger walked over. "You make this," he said. "Yes, sir," Colt said. The man looked back at the piece on the truck. He looked at Colt. "How old are you?" 15. The man was quiet for a moment. Then he put his hand out and Colt shook it. The truck pulled down the gravel road and turned onto the main road and was gone. Burrell came and stood beside his son. They watched until the truck was out of sight. "What are you going to work on next?" Burrell said. Colt thought about the walnut block in the corner of the barn, the one he had been watching for weeks, the one he had told his father he was waiting to hear from. He had heard from it now, or was beginning to. The grain moved through it in a specific way that he had been considering against the pages of his mother's sketchbook. "I think I know," he said. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in early March, when the year's first genuine warmth was working its way down from the mountains and the mud season was settling into the low ground around Asheville Hatch, Grindley appeared at the Mercer property again. This time he had his truck, and in the truck bed were 2 lengths of lumber and a bag of hardware, and he had the look of a man who has decided to do something and intends to do it correctly. Burrell came out. "I want to make a sign," Hatch said, "for the studio. Figure I owe that much." He looked at the barn. "If you'll let me." Burrell looked at the lumber. He looked at Hatch. "Come on in," he said. Hatch spent most of that Saturday at the secondary bench, working with the unhurried focus of a craftsman doing something he has done many times and intends to do well one final time. He cut the boards, jointed the edges, assembled the panel with structural attention that 4 decades of barn building produces as pure reflex. He carved the letters himself, not with Colt's complexity, but cleanly, precisely with the confidence of someone who knows what good lettering requires and how to provide it. Burrell watched for a while and then went back inside. Colt worked at his own bench without interrupting. By late afternoon, Hatch was done. He carried the sign to the barn door and held it up in the fading light. Mercer Wood Art Studio. The letters were clean and deep. The wood was a complementary tone to the barn's weathered siding, not matched exactly, but right in the way things are. Right when the person making them understands what right means for this specific situation. Colt looked at it. "Good," Hatch said. "Good," Colt said. They hung it together, Colt holding the sign level while Burrell drove the mounting hardware, Hatch directing from a step back with the eye of a man who has hung many things on many walls and knows when something is true. When it was done, all 3 of them stepped back and looked at it in the last of the afternoon light. Hatch put on his cap. He got in his truck and drove down the gravel road. The sound of his engine faded into the late afternoon. The wind in the pines, the birds returning to the feeders, Burrell kept at the yard's edge, the distant sound of traffic on the main road. Dex Hollowell came the following Tuesday. Not in the company truck he had retired 3 weeks earlier, his last day at Blue Ridge, coinciding almost exactly with the sign going up as though the two events had reached their natural conclusions at the same time. He drove his own F-25, and in the truck bed was a single piece of wood wrapped carefully in moving blankets, secured with 2 cargo straps, transported with more deliberate care than most people give to fragile things. He backed up to the barn the same way he had backed the company flatbed to that same spot for years. He killed the engine. He got out, lowered the tailgate, and began unwrapping the blankets. Burrell and Colt came out. What Dex had brought was a piece of black walnut he had set aside on the very first delivery to the Mercer property. The first Tuesday, the first load nearly a year ago. He had recognized it immediately, a section of black walnut with a figuring he had seen perhaps 4 times across 30 years of hauling hardwood. A swirling grain pattern in the center that moved outward in irregular concentric rings as though some disturbance long ago had interrupted the tree's growth and the tree had grown around it, incorporating the disruption, making it part of itself. He had kept it in his own garage, separate from the storage unit, wrapped in these moving blankets from the beginning. He had carried it through the full duration of the arrangement and had not put it with the others because he had not known what it was for. Only now, standing at the tailgate of his truck on this particular Tuesday morning, did he understand that he had been holding it for this moment specifically. He set it on the tailgate. "First piece I ever kept from this run," he said. "Figured you should have it." Colt stepped forward and put his hand on the wood. The grain under his palm was complex, the circular disturbance pattern moving outward from the center in those concentric irregular rings, the wood having spent decades growing around whatever had interrupted it, incorporating it, making it structural rather than accidental. He felt the pattern with his fingertips. He looked up at Dex. "Thank you," he said. The same 2 words he had said in the storage unit when Dex handed him the key. The same words carrying more weight now, the full weight of the year between that moment and this one, all the work and the storm and the people who had come through the barn door one at a time and left something behind. Dex nodded once. He loaded the empty straps into the truck bed. He looked at the sign above the barn door. "Good name," he said. He got in his truck. He drove down the gravel road. That evening after dinner, Colt went back to the barn alone. He sat at the workbench with his mother's sketchbook open in front of him. He had returned to it many times over the past months, for reference, for the comfort of her handwriting, for the practical information in the margin notes that he had come to rely on the way you rely on something that was written by someone who understood the work from the inside. He knew most of the pages well now. He turned to the back of the book. The final page with the line she had written in that smaller, more deliberate hand. "For the boy who will finish what I was afraid to start," was as he had always seen it. He turned the page past it toward the inside back cover and found for the first time what he had never noticed before. A piece of paper folded and tucked into the gap between the final page and the back board. Flush against the cover in a way that was invisible unless you were looking carefully or happened to be leafing through with enough deliberateness to catch the slight change in thickness. He took it out and unfolded it on the workbench. His mother's pencil, her hand unmistakably. A dragon small and coiled its body in a tight spiral with the tail wrapping up around the base. Beside it, in the margin, the notes he had come to expect from her black walnut tight grain. "Study the spiral before you begin. The center is the beginning." Below, the drawing in a heavier pressure, as though she had pressed harder with the pencil, wanting to be certain this particular line would survive whatever happened to the paper and to the years of final note. He will know what to do with this one. Colt sat at the workbench for a long time. The barn was quiet around him with its nighttime sounds. The small adjustments of old wood responding to the cold. The distant wind, the occasional voice of an animal somewhere beyond the tree line. The work light held its steady circle across the tools on the bench, across the organized stacks of remaining hardwood, across the walnut piece Dex had brought that afternoon, still sitting on its moving blankets. He looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he looked at the walnut piece, the circular grain pattern at its center. The disturbance the tree had grown around the interruption incorporated into its own structure across decades moved outward in a spiral from the center of the piece that was. He understood now with a clarity that arrived all at once exactly the geometry of the coiled dragon in his mother's drawing. The correspondence was not approximate. It was exact. As though the drawing and the wood had been moving toward each other across whatever distance of years separated them, converging on this Tuesday night in a barn in Asheville, North Carolina. He did not try to explain this. He received it the way he had learned to receive things that arrived beyond the reach of explanation as something real worth acknowledging, worth acting on. He picked up his pencil. He opened his own sketchbook to a fresh page. He began planning. The dragon would be small. His mother's notation had said no larger than her hand, and he intended to honor that precisely. Small work required a different quality of attention than large work, different tools. Finer decisions, less margin for error. But he had been building toward this kind of precision since the beginning, since the pocket knife and the fallen branches and the first attempts at birds that became wolves, that became everything that had led here. He worked on the planning for 2 hours. By midnight, he had made the decisions about orientation, about how the spiral of the coil would follow the spiral of the grain exactly so that the two would reinforce each other rather than compete. He put his pencil down and looked at what he had planned. It was right. He knew it with the same certainty he had been developing across a year of learning to tell the difference between what he hoped was right and what actually was. He folded his mother's drawing and placed it in the front cover of his own sketchbook, where he would see it every time he opened it. He turned off the work light. He stood in the barn doorway. The night was cold and clear. The mountains were dark shapes against a sky that held more stars than the town sky ever showed. Above the barn door, the sign Hatch Grindley had carved, Mercer Wood Art Studio. The letters, clean and deep, caught the yard lamplight. He went inside. He was up before 4. He had the tools laid out, the walnut piece positioned on the bench, the drawing open beside it before the neighborhood had made a sound. He worked for 2 hours before the alarm clock in his bedroom went off for school. He worked every afternoon that week and all of both weekend days, moving through the planning phase and into the first material contact with a focused care that felt different from previous projects, not more cautious exactly, but more deliberate. More intentional about each decision and what it meant in relation to the overall form. The walnut responded in the way that good material responds when it has been understood before it has been touched, not without resistance, but with a resistance that felt purposeful rather than arbitrary. The spiral grain moved through the blocking out phase and into the early detail work with a consistency that allowed him to make decisions confidently, knowing that the wood would hold what he was asking it to hold. The coil of the body came first, following the spiral of the grain exactly the way his mother's notation had instructed. The center is the beginning. He worked outward from the center the same way the tree had grown outward from the disturbance, incorporating rather than avoiding building the form around what was already there. The scales on a piece this small were different from the Godzilla scales in every technical respect. Each one required a smaller gouge, a lighter hand, a more precise angle. Where the Godzilla scales had been carved in sessions of sustained repetition, each one a variation on a developed pattern, these required individual attention. There were fewer of them. Each one mattered more. He spent 3 evenings on the head alone. The head of his mother's dragon, as she had drawn it, was small and triangular, the features suggesting intelligence rather than threat, something watchful rather than aggressive. Colt studied the drawing against the wood and found that the grain in the head section of the piece moved in a way that would naturally support this quality if he was careful about the angle of the eye cuts and the depth of the brow line. He was careful. On the 4th day, he began the tail. The tail wrapped up around the base of the coil in the drawing, following the curve of the body and grounding the piece, giving it a stability that the coiled posture alone would not have provided. In the walnut, the grain in the tail section ran in a direction that required him to adjust his approach, working against the grain in short, careful strokes rather than with it in longer ones, checking the surface frequently, not committing to depth until he was certain of the line. He finished the tail on a Sunday evening. He set the piece on the workbench and stepped back. It was small, no larger than a hand, exactly as his mother had specified. The walnut's dark, complex grain moved through the coil in the spiral pattern the tree had been building for decades before the wood was cut and deemed unsuitable for commercial use. The scales caught the worklight from inside their small individual depths. The head held the watchful quality he had been working toward, patient, intelligent old, in the way that things are old when they have been made from something that predates the making. He looked at it for a long time. Then he did something he had not planned to do that evening. He went into the house, found the pencil drawing his mother's drawing, the one he had folded into the front of his sketchbook, and brought it back to the barn. He set it on the workbench beside the finished piece, the drawing and the sculpture, the plan and the thing the plan had been pointing toward. Side by side in the work light, separated by whatever years had passed between June Mercer sitting down to plan something she was afraid to begin, and her son sitting in the same barn, her barn, their barn, finishing it. He looked at both of them for a long time. Then he carried the small dragon inside and set it on the kitchen table in the center, with the pencil drawing placed beside it opened so that the dragon sketch and the margin notes were visible. He set it there before he went to bed, while the house was quiet and the kitchen was dark. He went upstairs. He slept. At 6 in the morning, Burrell's feet on the stairs, the familiar cadence, the slight pause on the third step from the bottom that had a different sound than the others. The sound of the kitchen light, the sound of the coffee maker. Then silence, which was not the usual silence of a morning starting up, but a different quality of silence, the silence of someone who has stopped. Colt lay in his bed and listened to it. The silence held for a long time. Then he heard his father's chair being pulled back from the kitchen table. The sound of Burrell sitting down. Not moving, just sitting. Colt got up. He came down the stairs slowly and stood in the kitchen doorway. His father was sitting at the table with both hands resting on the surface, looking at the small walnut dragon in the center of the table and at the pencil drawing beside it. June's handwriting in the margins, the notation about grain direction and wood species, and below the drawing the line she had written in that heavier pressure, "He will know what to do with this one." Burrell's face held the expression of a man who has received something he did not know he was waiting for, and is deciding what to do with it. He looked up when Colt appeared in the doorway. Colt looked at his father. Neither of them said anything. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the early morning was still dark, the mountains invisible against a sky that was just beginning to consider changing. The coffee maker finished its cycle and went quiet. The small walnut dragon sat in the center of the table, patient in the way that finished things are patient with nothing left to prove. Burrell reached out and put his hand close to the piece, not touching it in the way Hatch Grindley had stood close to the Godzilla without touching it. The way you stand near things you want to honor without disturbing. Then he lowered his hand to the table. "Your mother planned this one," he said quietly. Not a question. "Yes," Colt said. Burrell nodded slowly. He looked at the pencil drawing, at his wife's handwriting in the margins, at the line she had written for the boy she had known would come after her, and would know what to do with what she had left behind. He did not say anything more for a while. Colt came in and sat down across from his father, and they sat together at the table in the early morning quiet while the light outside slowly changed. This was the language they had. Not words exactly, or not only words. The language of things left on tables in the morning. The language of magazines and early breakfasts and long drives and signs carved from complementary wood. The language of a key on a plain ring handed over in a storage unit. The language of a man who stayed home from work to drink a second cup of coffee. The language of everything said through the accumulation of small, deliberate acts by people who understood that meaning lived in what you actually did rather than in what you announced. Burrell looked at his son across the table. "What are you working on next?" he said. It was the same question he had asked standing beside the barn after the resort truck drove away. The same question carrying more now than it had then, carrying 3 years of Tuesday mornings, and the full weight of what had been built from them. Colt thought about the remaining stock in the barn, the pieces Dex's employees had been quietly setting aside, the wood that would keep coming as long as people who understood what it was for kept paying attention to it. He thought about his mother's sketchbook. The eagle with its wings spread, each feather individually sketched with a note about walnut for the dark sections and maple for the breast. The wolf mid-stride. The creatures that filled those pages, each one planned with precision by someone who had understood the work from the inside and had not been afraid of the planning only of the beginning. "I think there's an eagle," he said. Burrell looked at him. Something crossed his face, a small movement that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one, the expression of a man who recognizes something and is glad to recognize it. "I'll make breakfast," he said. He got up from the table. He moved to the stove with the slight stiffness in his lower back that was always present on cold mornings and that he never mentioned, and he began making the same breakfast he had made every morning for 3 years. The same eggs, the same careful attention given to a small daily act because he had decided that small daily acts deserved care. Colt stayed at the table for a moment longer, looking at the small walnut dragon and the pencil drawing beside it. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window, now the first real light of the day, pale and clear. It fell across the surface of the table and across his mother's handwriting and across the finished piece that had been until recently nothing but a drawing in the back of a sketchbook and a piece of discarded walnut in a dead tree's shadow. He got up and went out to the barn. The tools were where he had left them, laid out on the workbench in their order. The remaining hardwood was stacked along the walls in its organized way. The shelves held the pieces that had already been completed and those that were on their way. Above the barn door, visible through the open entrance, the sign held steady in the morning air. Colt stood at the workbench and opened his sketchbook. He turned to a fresh page. He picked up his pencil. Outside, somewhere down the gravel road, a truck was moving through the neighborhood. Not a timber truck, just the ordinary traffic of a Tuesday morning. But the sound of it, the familiar sound of something heavy moving slowly past on the road, produced in Colt the same response it had always produced, a kind of alertness, a turning of attention toward what was arriving. He set his pencil down. He went to the barn door and looked out. The road was empty. Just the wind in the pines and the birds starting up and the early light on the mountains and the ordinary sounds of a day beginning the way days had always begun. Here, with the world going about its business and a boy in a barn paying close attention to what was already there waiting to be found. He went back to the workbench. He picked up his pencil. He began.